My name is Kambiz Ranavardi, ColumbiaDC board member and a graduate School of Engineering and Applied Science. First, let me thank our partners for this event, Yale Club of Washington, D.C., and their members for joining us this evening. 50 years ago, on June 17th, this Friday exactly, but 50 years ago, there was a break-in, and what followed at the Watergate complex and what followed forever changed how the U.S. government is run and also how people's perception of how it is run. And we are very lucky and fortunate and honored to have one of the key players, former chief of the Watergate, the Special Prosecutor's Watergate Task Force, Richard Ben-Veniste, with us to talk about it. Our host is none other than our regular contributor, James A. Banner Jr., historian and author. So we are very honored. And I'm going to skip Richard's introduction, leave it to Jim. So please allow me to briefly introduce our host. James M. Banner Jr. holds a BA from Yale and a PhD from Columbia. He was a member of the history department at Princeton from 66 to 80, which he left to found the American Association for the Advancement of the Humanities. A former Guggenheim Fellow, he is the author of many books and articles in American history, the discipline of history, education, and public affairs. Among his books are To the Hartford Convention, The Federalists and the Origins of Party Politics in Massachusetts from 1789 to 1815, a co-authored with Harold Cannon, The Elements of Teaching and the Elements of Learning, Being a Historian, an Introduction to the Professional World of History, and the most recent book, The Ever-Changing Past, Why All History is Revisionist History. I would like to briefly also add that Jim also contributed to the Congressional Judiciary Committee by providing research on historical perspective on presidential misconduct. So without further ado, Jim, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Kambiz. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's nice to have all of you here. It's hard to believe that on Friday we mark the 50th anniversary of the break-in of the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate, and find ourselves, those of us who witnessed that and are still alive, as Richard and I are back in the soup again. But I can think of no one who is better placed and more deeply informed to lead us through the original crisis that took place 50 years ago, 2 nights from now, than Richard Ben-Veniste. Richard is recognized, I think, throughout the country as one of the most highly skilled and respected and civic-minded litigator and investigator in the United States. And he's someone whom none other than the redoubtable F. Lee Bailey called one of the towering giants of the American legal profession. He's been involved in private practice here in Washington, his specialty being civil litigation and white-collar crime. Richard rose to national prominence, I think we all knew, during the Watergate crisis as special prosecutor for Archibald Cox and Archie Cox's office, and then after the Saturday Night Massacre, also for Cox's successor, Leon Jaworski. He figures prominently in what Richard and I agree is now the best work of history on the Watergate crisis, and that's Garrett Graff's recent book, Watergate, A New History, and I commend it to everyone's attention. He is also, however, the author of books himself, with his Watergate colleague, George Frampton Jr., in, I think, 1978. He authored a book called Stonewall, The Real Story of the Watergate Prosecution. And in 2009, he alone brought out a book, The Emperor's New Clothes, which I hold in my hand here, which I recommend to you, which with remarkable lack of ego for a memoir of this kind. He relates his participation not only in the Watergate crisis, but abscam, Whitewater investigation, and the 9/11 Commission. As you'll probably be able to tell from the inflection of Richard's voice and his scrappiness, he is a native of the New York City borough of Queens. He commuted from Queens during his high school years to attend and graduate from Stuyvesant High School, one of the prized public schools in New York City, and then attended Muhlenberg College. He returned to New York to take a law degree from Columbia, and then went to Northwestern Law School to take a LMM. And from there, or while there, he was asked to take up a coveted position as assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York. And he practiced there. He was head, if I'm not mistaken, of the official corruption section of that office for about 5 years before he was plucked to join Archibald Cox here in Washington. And as we historians say, the rest was history. And he has continued his civic service, and I think that's one of the most commendable and remarkable aspect of his long career. Counselor, especially tonight, and among those who hold, as you and I do, Columbia degrees, I welcome you. The Zoom room is now yours.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Benner, for that very extensive introduction, and thank you to Cambiz Ranavardi and to the associations of both Columbia and Yale who are attending this evening. The enduring lesson of Watergate is that the system worked, demonstrating the principle that under our system, no man is above the law. Indeed, Garrett Graff, who just was mentioned by Professor Ballard, praised the incredible work and majesty of the American democracy that unfolded from January 1973 to August 1974, as Washington confronted a corrupt and criminal president. It took the combined efforts of all three branches of government, plus a special prosecutor, to achieve results that no one thought possible. And yet, there is a more nuanced and troubling context. But for a combination of facts and circumstances unique to Watergate, I believe Richard Nixon would have served out his term as president. As I wrote in my 1977 book entitled Stonewall, referred to by Professor Ballard, what if Nixon had destroyed his tapes in July 1973? Without an extraordinary display of public outrage when the president sought to defy a clear order, and without the courage of a few judges and legislators, it might have all turned out differently. The break-in and burglary of the National Committee's headquarters at the Watergate office building on June 17, 1972, was not the isolated and loopy third-rate burglary portrayed by the Nixon administration. It was a significant violation of law authorized by the Nixon insiders at the highest level to conduct illegal electronic eavesdropping and collect the political and personal intelligence against adversaries that Richard Nixon craved. The Watergate break-in was just one link in a chain of abuses that Nixon's Attorney General John Mitchell later dubbed the White House horrors. These included the break-in at a psychiatrist's office looking for information that could be used to smear Daniel Ellsberg, who had exposed the secret government history of the Vietnam War known as the Pentagon Papers. The misuse of the Internal Revenue Service and other federal agencies to punish those on the president's ever-expanding enemies list. The illegal wiretapping of journalists and members of Nixon's own administration. The proposed firebombing of the Brookings Institution as a cover for the theft of records. The surreptitious surveillance of political opponents and the willingness to use thugs to brutalize anti-war protesters. The subsequent cover-up was not an irrational response to an insignificant and stupid break-in. Rather, it was a reflective reaction to the threat that the administration's crimes and widespread abuses of governmental authority would be exposed once investigators began probing the prior activities of the Watergate burglars. Acting with the president's blessing, several top advisors committed perjury, including John Mitchell, who had been Attorney General, Nixon's Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman, and Chief Domestic Policy Advisor John Ehrlichman. Offers of presidential clemency were secretly extended to members of the burglary team, and all were paid significant amounts of hush money from a secret slush fund controlled by the president and Haldeman. All of this was supervised and coordinated by White House counsel John Dean with the president's direct and enthusiastic encouragement. My personal connection to Watergate began on the 4th of July, 1973, when I arrived in Washington, a 30-year-old federal prosecutor from the Southern District of New York, with 5 years of prosecutorial experience under my belt. Recruited by Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox to join his newly created office, staffed mostly by the brightest of his recently graduated Harvard Law students, a handful of Harvard Law professors like Phil Hyman and Stephen Breyer, and an even fewer number of lawyers who, like me, had at least some courtroom experience. I sought and received an assignment to work on the investigation of whether a criminal conspiracy to obstruct justice had taken place to hide the roles of administration higher-ups in Watergate, a criminal conspiracy perpetrated by the highest officials in the nation, perhaps including the President of the United States himself. A major turning point came when John Dean, the White House counsel, succumbed to relentless pressure from us to either plead guilty or be indicted and stand trial for his role in the cover-up. Dean entered a guilty plea on Friday, October 19, 1973. The next day, one of the most dramatic and riveting events in recent political history burst like a bombshell into the living rooms of tens of millions of Americans. The crisis had begun some weeks before when Nixon aide Alexander Butterfield revealed to Senate investigators the existence of a surreptitious, voice-activated White House taping system that would surely have recorded Watergate-related conversations between Nixon and his top aides. We issued a grand jury subpoena for the tapes of 9 specific conversations, which we had identified through testimony and White House logs. We believe those tapes could provide unequivocal evidence of what was said behind closed doors. Nixon ordered Cox to withdraw the subpoena and instead accept summaries of the conversations prepared by the White House and authenticated by a 72-year-old Mississippi senator named John Stennis, a conservative Democrat and Nixon ally, who, in addition to being hard of hearing, was recovering from a gunshot wound inflicted in a Capitol Hill mugging. Further, Cox would have to promise not to subpoena any additional tapes or documents from the White House. Cox refused the so-called Stennis Compromise, explaining that such summaries would not be admissible in court, nor would he have any independent way of vouching for their accuracy. Cox held a news conference at the Washington Press Club, televised live by the major networks on Saturday afternoon, to explain to the public why he could not accede to the president's demand that he drop the subpoena. And I'll pause to suggest to those of you who have not seen a video of Archie Cox's press conference, do yourselves a favor and obtain it. It's on the internet. It is one of the most striking and remarkable historical artifacts of Watergate. You should all watch it. There was an eerie silence as we left Archie's press conference to await the president's next move. The president responded by ordering Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire Cox, notwithstanding the fact that both Chief Judge John Sirica and the Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit had upheld the subpoenas and ordered the White House to produce the tapes. But Richardson refused to fire Archie Cox. The Democrat-controlled Senate had conditioned confirmation of Richardson's appointment as Attorney General on his willingness to appoint a special prosecutor to take on the Watergate investigation. Richardson had promised the Judiciary Committee that he would appoint a Watergate special prosecutor with significant measure of independence in pursuing the investigation, and Richardson chose Archibald Cox, his former law professor at Harvard, to lead the investigation. As the crisis reached its zenith, Richardson could not square the guarantee of independence to Cox with Nixon's order to fire him for simply pursuing through legal process the best evidence of what had transpired behind closed doors. Richardson resigned rather than carry out the order to fire Cox. Richardson's deputy, William Ruckelshaus, also refused to fire Nixon when the new chief of staff, General Alexander Haig, ordered him to carry out Nixon's order. Finally, the president found someone willing to do his bidding in Solicitor General Robert Bork, who did the deed and executed the firing of Archibald Cox. The firestorm of public revulsion against Nixon's sheer use of power to remove Cox and shutter the Watergate Special Prosecution Office employing the FBI to seize our files and denying Cox's assistant Watergate prosecutors entry to our own offices was immediate and dramatic. For me and my young colleagues at the Watergate Special Prosecutor's Office, the experience was the closest thing to a coup d'etat that we had ever witnessed in America. Suddenly, the rule of law was suspended and naked force had replaced it. The same FBI agents who had been working earnestly with us for months were now occupying our offices on orders from the president. Of course, January 6th was worse by orders of magnitude. It was the Saturday Night Massacre on steroids. We will no doubt explore a bit of that comparison during the question and answer period. Telegrams, letters, and phone calls, there was no internet or electronic social media, flooded into Washington in unprecedented quantity, protesting what the press immediately dubbed the Saturday Night Massacre. Within days, Nixon reversed course and promised to produce the subpoenaed tapes and authorize the appointment of a new special prosecutor with a written charter assuring independence. But in the process, the public and members of Congress in increasingly larger numbers sensibly began to ask, what was Nixon hiding? A lot. The first tranche of tapes, even without what we later proved was the deliberately erased 18.5 minutes of a June 20, 1972 conversation between Nixon and Haldeman, contained evidence devastating to the president and his top lieutenants. In both tone and substance, the tape recorded conversations repudiated a host of prior denials and protestations of ignorance by Nixon about a broad conspiracy to obstruct justice and commit perjury. No discussion of obeying the law or holding the violators to account was seriously discussed or considered. The only options centered on how to slip the noose that was slowly tightening around the conspirators as the cover-up began to implode. Indeed, over the years, the scores of additional Watergate-related tapes that have been released over ensuing decades provide not a scintilla of exculpatory evidence in favor of Nixon. Interestingly, while Nixon fired Archie Cox and announced that he was abolishing the Watergate Special Prosecution Force, he couldn't actually fire the rest of us on Cox's staff, as we were all Department of Justice protected civil service employees. So there we were, somewhat dazed and confused, feeling perhaps like the survivors of Custer's Last Stand. But we got up, dusted ourselves off, and got back to work with even greater determination. Shortly, under the supervision of the newly minted special prosecutor, chosen by the very man who improperly fired our incorruptible Archie Cox, Once the first tranche of tapes arrived, I, along with George Frampton and Jill Wine, were the first to listen to them. One was particularly devastating, a March 21 conversation between John Dean and Richard Nixon, which has become known as the cancer on the presidency conversation. Dean had gone to the president to tell him that the cover-up was becoming too difficult to manage, and counseled the president that it should be ended quickly in order for Nixon to escape its clutches. And let me read very briefly from a transcript of that March 21 conversation. Dean, I think there's no doubt about the seriousness of the problem where we've got a cancer within, close to the presidency, that's growing. It's growing daily, it's compounding, it's growing geometrically now because it compounds itself. Dean explained the demand for hush money coming from the Watergate burglars. How much money do you need? Asked the president. I would say these people are going to cost $1 million over the next 2 years. The president. Let me cut it this way. Let's suppose that you can get the $1 million and you can get the proper way to handle it. Could you hold that side? And Dean, The president, it would seem to me that would be worthwhile. Nixon then asked the rhetorical question that would establish him as a member of the conspiracy. But at the moment, don't you agree that you better get the Hunt thing? I mean, that's worth it at the moment. And that's why for your immediate thing, you've got no choice with Hunt, but the 120 or whatever, right? Dean, that's right. Would you agree, said the president, that it's a buy time thing? You better damn well get it done, but fast. Amazing. Nixon had rejected Dean's overture to end the cover-up, counseling Dean instead to continue payments of hush money, and to our further amazement, attempting to school his young lawyer and H.R. Haldeman, who had entered the meeting, on how to testify falsely while evading prosecution for perjury. That same night, on Dean's go-ahead, E. Howard Hunt, one of the Watergate burglars, was paid $120,000 in cash. Now, prior to the Saturday Night Massacre, even with the televised Senate hearings in which former White House counsel John Dean gave damaging testimony implicating the president and high administration officials and campaign officials in the Nixon re-election, in a wide-ranging conspiracy to obstruct justice, it seemed that most Americans were willing to give the president the benefit of the doubt. Nixon and his aides refuted Dean's claims and said they had no knowledge of, much less involvement in, illegal activity. I believe that the Saturday Night Massacre was the turning point in Nixon's downfall. New bombshells were exploding in the aftermath of the Saturday Night Massacre that further undermined the public's confidence in Nixon. On one of the subpoenaed tapes, June 20th, 1972, a conversation between Nixon and Haldeman, only 3 days after the break-in. 18 and a half minutes of conversation were obliterated. Judge Sirica agreed to allow us to explore in public hearings the White House's anomalous explanations for discrepancies, for wholesale obliteration of the subpoenaed tapes. The 18.5-minute gap, and my colleague Jill Wine, pause to mention, my Columbia 68, a year behind me, and her dramatic cross-examination of Rosemary Woods, Nixon's longtime personal secretary, are etched in Watergate history. And this further eroded Nixon's credibility. I hope Jill is listening this evening and will lash me with questions when the time arises. The tapes hearings provided Nixon with a choice between incompetence and venality. The venality of the continuation of the conspiracy to obstruct justice with Cox's firing, and then the bogus explanation for missing and obliterated tape recordings was becoming increasingly evident to the American people. Meanwhile, we were preparing an indictment for those most senior members of the administration who joined the criminal conspiracy to obstruct the investigation to determine who was responsible for ordering the Watergate break-in. A major question was what to do about Richard Nixon. Leon Jaworski, the new special prosecutor, was adamant that Nixon, as a sitting president, should not be indicted, and was equally clear that he could not be mentioned in the indictment. I agreed that impeachment was a constitutionally preferable way of dealing with certain presidential criminal behavior. But how could we ignore the evidence of Nixon's acts in furtherance of the conspiracy, especially his direction to Dean to continue paying hush money to the burglars? Moreover, how could we overcome the heavy hearsay objections to admissibility of the tape recorded conversations that were undoubtedly coming to prevent us from using what was now our most potent evidence? So here's a piece of inside baseball. We came up with a practical and creative solution that would satisfy our immediate needs and might satisfy Jaworski's reluctance to get ahead of the curve. Why not have the grand jury vote to authorize us to name a specific roster of unindicted co-conspirators at a later time, while at the same time voting on the defendants to be included by name in the indictment? This, I reasoned to Leon, would give him cover when the prosecutors were obliged to identify all unindicted co-conspirators by motion from the defense. Jaworski acceded, and the grand jurors were allowed to vote. And they voted to authorize the special prosecutor to name Nixon as an unindicted co-conspirator at the appropriate time in the proceedings. Following the indictment of Mitchell, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman, we readied ourselves for trial. We issued a trial subpoena calling for the White House to produce an additional 64 tape-recorded conversations. Among these was a conversation between Nixon and H.R. Haldeman that occurred on June 23rd, 1972, 6 days after the Watergate burglars were arrested. Again, Nixon dug in his heels and was refusing to produce any more tapes. This time, we had to go all the way to the Supreme Court to compel the president to turn over the evidence. We had kept secret the grand jury's vote to authorize us to name Nixon as an unindicted co-conspirator until we needed to reveal it to counter the expected hearsay argument. It came, made by the president's lawyer, James St. Clair, on a Sunday morning on all the television Sunday morning programs. We met with James St. Clair and Alexander Haig, Nixon's new chief of staff, in a dramatic meeting in the map room at the White House that very Sunday morning. I gave James St. Clair the transcript of the grand jury's vote to authorize us to name Richard Nixon. He turned white. Alexander Haig simply shook his head in disbelief. The tapes would be admissible. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously, affirming Judge Sirica's ruling that Nixon must comply with our trial subpoena. The content of the so-called smoking gun tape shows that Nixon, 6 days after the burglars were arrested, issuing instructions to have the deputy director of CIA, Vernon Walters, go to the acting director of the FBI, L. Patrick Gray, and falsely claim that the FBI's investigation was harming ongoing CIA operations. The June 23rd tape shows why Nixon again put up such a furious fight to withhold the tapes. With the Supreme Court's unanimous vote in our favor, Nixon's bald-faced lies were now exposed for all to see when his own tape-recorded words were found to contradict his earlier denials of knowledge, much less involvement in the cover-up. Importantly, the tapes also gave the lie to the assurances of innocence Nixon had made privately to the congressional leaders of his own party. No amount of spin control could save Nixon from the web of deception that entangled him. Facing certain impeachment, conviction, and removal from office, Nixon resigned. The emperor stood naked, stripped of the defensive camouflage he had used to dupe and mislead the citizens of the United States. So in conclusion, magic words, and returning to the proposition that Watergate may well represent a one-off, unique moment in history, when all the planets aligned in a way to allow our institutions to function, to expel a corrupt president. Let me point out some of the what-ifs that we may wish to pursue further in the Q&A period. What if Nixon had not installed a voice-activated tape recording system that captured critical conversations about the Watergate cover-up? What if both houses of Congress were not controlled by the opposition party and no Senate Select Committee chaired by Senator Sam Ervin was empowered to investigate Watergate? What if some judge other than Chief Judge John Sirica had been assigned to the trial of the Watergate burglars? What if Washington Post owner Katharine Graham had acceded to the threats of financial and regulatory retaliation if she didn't order Watergate coverage to stand down? What if the Senate had not made it a condition of Elliot Richardson's confirmation as Attorney General that he appoint an independent special prosecutor to investigate Watergate? What if Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox had succumbed to the pressure put on him by the president, and yes, Richardson himself, and had withdrawn the subpoena for the tapes and accepted the so-called Stennis Compromise? What if instead of firing Archie Cox, Nixon had burned all the tapes, perhaps claiming that the privacy interests of those he had surreptitiously recorded justified their destruction? What if Patrick Gray had agreed to the CIA's request to limit the FBI's investigation? This would have provided potent ammunition to those who were arguing that the Watergate break-in was in fact a CIA operation. What if Leon Jaworski didn't push for a trial subpoena for 64 tapes, including what turned out to be the smoking pistol tape that put the nail in Nixon's coffin? Yes, the system worked well enough under the unique circumstances then present. But because ours is a government of laws and individuals who gave effect to those laws for the benefit of the governed, the system worked magnificently. But were it not for the extraordinary contributions of individuals who played key roles in Watergate, Judge John Sirica, Senator Sam Ervin, Chairman Peter Rodino, Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox, Attorney General Elliot Richards, Publisher Katharine Graham, Special Prosecutor Leon Jaworski, and others, the result might well have been different. As I wrote 10 years ago in a memoir mentioned by Professor Ballard, The Emperor's New Clothes, in the end, I look back on Watergate as something of an aberration. We saw a deeply flawed president. We saw congressional leaders of the opposition party empowered and willing to investigate excesses of power. A nationally respected newspaper willing to investigate and print, notwithstanding the risk of threatened reprisals. We saw a small number of Republican congressmen and senators who put allegiance to the Constitution and the rule of law ahead of party loyalty. We saw two special prosecutors determined to carry out their sworn responsibilities efficiently and capably, and a federal judge who, in the twilight of his career, was determined to order the President of the United States to obey the law and provide evidence to a grand jury. And ultimately, this unanimous Supreme Court, including 4 justices appointed by the same president, affirm the principle that no man is above the law. Perhaps the lasting lesson of Watergate is for democracy to persevere. We, the people, have no right to remain silent in the face of autocratic challenge to our constitutional democracy. To honor the memory of those who did their duty and more in Watergate, I'll conclude with the words of the great Elie Wiesel. Action is the only remedy to indifference, the most insidious danger of all. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you so much, Richard. I appreciate your remarks. We have a lot of questions coming in. I would like to ask everybody to continue to add their questions in the Q&A box, and we will address them as we have time. So since you almost ended with what ifs, here's actually a question that may start the conversation. Was there any particular event that broke the case, which at some point seemed to be, bogged down above others that pushed the case in towards success, like Gray's confirmation hearing revealing Dean's role, or McCord's letter to Judge Sirica? What is your opinion, if there was one case that pushed it forward?
Well, I think McCord's letter was the beginning of the end, where Sirica's heavy sentence on McCord induced him to break with the others, and particularly when there was the suggestion that they were going to try to blame the whole thing, the White House, on the CIA, and McCord was a career CIA guy. I think that was an extraordinary moment. And then I think our ability to get the tapes, even though some of them were destroyed, was tremendously significant. But before that happened, the Saturday Night Massacre, as I said, was of great significance in turning the people of the United States in a different direction. They no longer were willing to give Nixon the benefit of the doubt. Why had he done such a thing that had caused such a conflagration? All the networks broke in to announce what had happened. Not only had he fired the man who was investigating him, who was shown in his press conference to be the living embodiment of Mr. Smith coming to Washington, an honest man who was doing his job, now fired. And the Attorney General of the United States refusing to obey the president's order, the deputy the same. It was an extraordinary, extraordinary moment. And then, of course, when we saw the evidence, we didn't know what we were going to get at the end of the day. Was this all going to be some kind of a ruse cooked up by Nixon just to get rid of Cox? And there'd be nothing on the tape at all? But now we had conclusory evidence of Nixon's own participation as a member of the conspiracy. This was extraordinary.
Thank you so much. And by the way, yes, you asked and you receive here. I have a question from Jill Winebanks, fellow Colombian and contributor to and defender of a constitution, I would say. Here's a question. Do you think if there was Fox News and social media at that time, Nixon would have escaped? I'll let you off easier than Rosemary Woods. That's what she says. Do you still think a sitting or a former president should not be indicted? Or do you think if Nixon had been indicted rather than an unindicted co-conspirator, that Trump might have been deterred from his conduct, which Jerry believes it satisfies all the elements of many crimes?
Well, to the latter, it was unsettled law, and it's still unsettled law. So whether a sitting president could be indicted. My view, as I mentioned, was that a sitting president with a vigorous impeachment committee in operation should be, in the first instance at least, should go through the impeachment process, a constitutionally mandated process. What if the President of the United States, say Richard Nixon, had taken a golf club instead of simply pushed his press secretary Ron Ziegler one day in a moment of extreme frustration? What if he'd brained him and killed him on the spot? Does that president have a right to remain in office and not suffer criminal prosecution for something that was so obviously in violation of the law? You know, those are different questions. Of course, if we had moved to indict the sitting president, and I don't think Archie Cox would have gone along with that proposition either. If we had done that, the case would go to the Supreme Court, and there would be a focus on that for years, I think, and the country would be in chaos had that happened under those circumstances.
Jim, any comments that you might have to share and ask questions?
Yes, thank you. Richard, if we keep broadening this out a little bit to our current crisis, do you think that there's any connection, either necessary or just sort of accidental, in the progression of the kind of crises we've faced in the last 50 years, from Nixon's, which was a kind of orchestration of corruption from the Oval Office, to Iran-Contra, where there was a cabal in the White House orchestrating arms deals and so on in contravention of the law, to where we stand now, which is a culture, a political and social culture, which so enrages groups of people that at the president's urging, a mob attacks the Capitol. Has there been a progressive failure of law? Are these just three sort of accidentally critical moments that have no connection to each other? How, given your experience through all of these, in fact, starting back in the 1970s, would you view the 50 years of really grave crisis, of which I certainly think today's is the gravest?
Well, I agree with you, and let me start with the last. For all we might say about Richard Nixon and his criminal activity and his proclivity toward authoritarianism, I don't believe that if Richard Nixon had gone through any of the what ifs, if they had gone the other way, and Richard had survived, wounded perhaps as a president, if he burned the tapes, that would have marked the end of our democracy. In short, we would have survived Nixon. We're in a different situation now. Nixon, in my view, did not pose an existential threat to the existence and continuation of our democratic institutions. I believe Donald Trump did and does. A word about Ronald Reagan and the Iran-Contra. I thought that was far more serious than it was actually taken at the time. And what I thought was the most serious aspect of it was the fact that Ronald Reagan had used an off-the-shelf paramilitary force that he created, funded by foreign governments secretly, authoritarian foreign governments, and utilized that as part of his presidential force, personal presidential force. That was an extraordinary event that I don't think has yet found its sufficient description in our history.
Thank you. Maybe I start with the questions keep coming in. Here's a question. An anonymous attendee asks, there were 3 investigations overall. Basically, it was House, Senate, and Judge Sirica's criminal investigation. Do you believe any one of these were more essential in holding, the Nixon admin accountable, just like tapes, than the other one in revealing the truth?
Well, just to put it in the proper sequence, Judge Sirica, as a member of the judiciary, did not conduct a criminal investigation. The first investigation was conducted by the FBI in conjunction with the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia. And then that investigation produced information, and very useful information, that we utilized. That the Senate Watergate Committee under Senator Sam Ervin, whose chief counsel was Sam Dash, who played an extraordinary role in developing evidence, and we utilized that evidence. But the Senate was unable to get the tapes. The courts rejected the efforts of the Senate and the House themselves to obtain the tape recordings that we were able to get through the grand jury and later as the trial, because the court regarded that as an intramural dispute between equal branches of government. But we were able as prosecutors to get that information and then turn it over to the House, which then followed on the Senate's investigation, the earlier investigation, and the FBI's investigation, and the special prosecutor's investigation. In fact, we delivered to the House committee, sitting as an impeachment committee, a roadmap under the auspices of Judge Sirica, who had authority to order secret grand jury proceedings be released in an impeachment investigation. Something I may add that Robert Mueller did not do in connection with the Trump investigation.
And maybe I'll ask.
Then the House began to conduct its own investigation and voted out in committee the impeachment resolutions. And then Nixon, in the face of certain impeachment and conviction by the Senate and removal from office, resigned.
Maybe ask one more question, a combined question. I'm combining a couple of questions before I send it to Jim. Here's a question. What is your opinion on the limit of executive privilege, which was the topic of a Supreme Court decision which allowed the tape to be released? And another person asked, I guess it's tangentially related, what is your opinion on Bush versus Gore from Supreme Court? It may not be related, but.
Well, Bush versus Gore excuse me, is settled. The opinion that I have is that Vice President Gore, to his and our enormous credit as a nation, accepted the results of a very close and contested election, utilized as best he could legal process to ensure that the election results were warranted, and then graciously conceded. Nixon did the same thing when he lost to John F. Kennedy. That is what our country is built on. The transfer of power in a peaceful manner by people who respect the law and respect what this country is all about. Unlike the recent occupant.
Jim, no comments on you? Okay. Well,
Not now. I'd like to reserve a question toward the end.
All right, you have the rain check. Steve Shore asks, has computer hacking essentially obviated the need for physical break-ins? So maybe happening, but in different forms.
I don't think there was a need for a physical break-in of the DNC headquarters. That was absurd. It was crazy. It was Gildan and Lilly, and it was only a reflection of the tone at the top at the White House. Nixon rewarded those who would bring him whatever scurrilous piece of gossip or information against his enemies that could be used. And so this was tremendous overkill in the 1972 election, which Nixon won in a landslide. There is no need, and there never should be any need for a break-in. And computer hacking is what it is, and we won't go down that road, but we've got to be aware of basically anything that's said could be fair game for exploitation, and act accordingly with appropriate safeguards. And the more open our society is, the less there is a need to keep the secrets.
Okay. Well, maybe before Jim, I'm going to stand by if you have any questions, but here's a question, the couple of questions. Do we actually know who ordered, if there was an explicit order of break-in, who decided that the place would be, the target would be the DNC headquarters? So do we know that until today?
Well, actually, this was the second break-in of the DNC headquarters. They had earlier, the same team had broken in and placed a bug. The bug was malfunctioning, but however, there were transcripts that were transmitted to H.R. Haldeman of what was being said in the DNC offices. And so that was an ongoing illegal wiretapping of that headquarters. There had been other buggings and others attempted. So who had, in the first instance, authorized this team of ne'er-do-wells, miscreants, and lunatics, a Nazi, Gordon Liddy, along with his pal, Howard Hunt, who were the gang that couldn't shoot straight as far as the Watergate break-in was concerned. Their bug didn't work properly, and they got caught. Who had authorized this? Well, Liddy had put a plan to Attorney General Mitchell, who then became Nixon's campaign chief and the interestingly acronymed CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, and funded by CREEP funds, campaign contributions. So it was the evolution of this philosophy to get Nixon what he craved and be rewarded for it. It's the cat bringing the mouse to the master's feet. And that happened time and time again in the Nixon White House until it spun out of control. The White House horrors, as John Mitchell called them, were many, and I've only touched on a few.
This question particularly because I am in engineering. This is funny. In Graf's book that you recommended, there is a funny scene where you were reviewing how to recover the information on that deleted tape with scientists and engineers, and it was such a kind of gibberish conversation with you that you had to get out of that meeting and have a lighthearted moment with actually the President's Council. Can you expand on that?
Well, there was so much tension that built up that from time to time we'd have to let it off like steam in a pressure cooker. At this time, we were working with a team of noted scientists, the most extraordinary group who had been assembled to look at tape recordings to essentially see first whether anything on the 18.5-minute gap tape could be recovered. We knew there was human voice. We knew there was a preceding and following conversation. So 18.5 minutes were obliterated. Could we pick up anything? The answer was no. Then, could they somehow detect how the tape was erased? And they were able to do it. And it took several weeks of intensive labor by these extraordinary engineers from all over the country that we jointly assembled. And I remember Carl Feldbaum, one of my colleagues on the Watergate Special Prosecution team, and I, late at night, in the executive office building, attending meetings of the tape experts. We were allowed to sit in, but we could understand very little of what they were saying. At one point, they were trying to, they were talking about something played backwards that was, just completely gibberish. So I looked across the room at Len Garment, who was my favorite among the opposition lawyers. And Len Garment was a man, a cultured man, a man of the world, a man with a sense of humor, a fellow New Yorker. And Len and I looked at each other, and we walked out of the room, and we walked down the hall, and we just collapsed. We just collapsed in laughter, holding each other until the tears came. And that was an extraordinary moment of lightheartedness that we were able to share. But those were few and far between, let me tell you.
Well, I mean, at the end, I would say that they have found out that the tape was erased, I think, 5 to 9 times, and it was clear that it wasn't an accident.
Yes, extraordinary. And I remember a fellow named Dick Stockton, who was on the witness stand being cross-examined. You say that you can prove with certainty that someone pressed their finger on the record button and went over that tape at least 5 times and maybe 7, said one of the defense lawyers. And Stockton replied, He might have used a stick.
Interesting. All right, Jim, interrupt me if you have any questions, but questions are coming. Go ahead.
Thank you, Ken, but let me, Richard, ask one other question. Drawing from your experience 50 years ago, there was a good deal of reform, so-called reform legislation passed by the Congress and signed by succeeding presidents after the crisis had subsided a bit. What gaps in legislation still exist in your view, if any, that might have prevented the situation we find ourselves in today? And second part of that question is given what we so far know about what has gone on in the White House and afterwards, what kind of legislation would you propose, or are you advising members of Congress to draft and try to get through the Congress?
Well, fundamentally, as we look at what President Trump early on in his presidency referred to as his Second Amendment people, the proliferation of high-powered military-style armaments in the country, in the hands of individuals who belong to fringe groups, who listened to the most outlandish, crazy propaganda that no one with an education could possibly conceive an adult adhering to, is a real danger. So the question of curbing America's unique in the world, as far as I'm concerned, laxity in controlling military arms is a critical goal. The Supreme Court, in allowing unlimited campaign contribution, has made the Watergate reforms completely invalid. They have taken us from a world of sensible regulation into uncharted waters where money can buy the things that can reach individuals and influence them in ways that the creators of our constitutional government never conceived would be employable. Our founders feared the mob. They feared propaganda. They feared individuals who might incite the public. But they relied on the fact that educated persons would be able to counter the influence of such people. Our education system has failed. We don't seem to have the kind of civic-minded education that I remember receiving as a child, that put us all in the same boat as Americans, that said, you know, if we have a common enemy to fight, then we're going to make sacrifices to fight it. We're not going to come up with wackadoodle conspiracy theories to thwart science, to vaccinate a population against a pandemic, to vaccinate the minds of individuals with alternative truths. These are things that are posing a threat to us now that are unanticipated. And that's why I mention in my closing the words of Elie Wiesel. people have to rise up and protect their democracy. It isn't a given that a democracy will survive just because it's good. It's a good form of government. Democracies have collapsed in the past. And there's many historical examples of that, as Professor Ballard and others can well tell us. We need to safeguard what we've got, or we're going to lose it. And we came extraordinarily close to losing it on January 6th. My own view is that if there had been violence in the street to confront the thugs who came to Washington, various organizations of percenters and other strangely named groups of right-wing conspiratorialists. If there had been confrontation in the street, I believe Trump was itching to use martial law to pause the whole process, to do what Mike Pence, to his great credit, would not do. And we're lucky to have survived that. Lucky. And we have got to act as a nation to protect our democracy, or we will lose it.
Thanks for your comments. Here are just combining two or three or four questions that are what ifs, and maybe you can answer them if you haven't. If J. Edgar Hoover was the head of the FBI, would there have been a cover-up to begin with? That's one. The second thing is that why wouldn't Nixon erase the tape? Is it because it was a delusion that there was nothing incriminating in them, or what was the issue? And then maybe third question is, what do you see if the early roles of journalists, investigative journalists like Bob Woodward and Bernstein, if they didn't pursue, would we have had a investigation?
Okay, 3 is my limit to try to remember. Let me start with why didn't Nixon destroy the tapes? Well, that's a very good question, because if he had destroyed the tapes, as I said, I think he would have survived as president. The tapes corroborated Dean, and whatever corroborating testimony that we had been able to put together, I think, certainly would not have amounted to changing America's mind about Nixon. We might have gotten convictions on some of the others, but the tapes were critical, essential to getting Nixon into the position of his resignation. Why didn't he destroy them? We didn't know. Alexander Haig, in his autobiography, said that Nixon, at the very late on, asked Haig to destroy the tapes. And Haig said, "Why don't you ask Manolo Sanchez, your valet, to do it? Because it's too dangerous for me to do. I have too much reputation at stake. Why don't you get your valet to do it?" And if Hoover had been director of the FBI, that is a really, really difficult question, because Hoover and Nixon were close. Hoover wouldn't do everything that Nixon asked him to do, and that's why the plumbers unit at the White House was created, because there were certain things that even J. Edgar Hoover wouldn't do. Would he have investigated as vigorously without the presence of a strong FBI director? Probably not. Probably not. And the FBI did a terrific job in the beginning in piecing all this out. And finally, journalists. Well, of course, the work of Woodward and Bernstein and about a dozen other journalists. And I think Garrett Graff is very good at giving credit where credit is due to the journalists who pursued Watergate and the cover-up. But it was essential to bring to the public the information that they were digging up that was secret and behind closed doors. Trump, on the other hand, did the same things and many more than Nixon, but he did them openly. Take, for example, the offer of clemency. Nixon's offers of clemency were made in secret to the burglars to keep them quiet. Trump publicly stated that he didn't want anybody cooperating with the Mueller investigation. He didn't want anybody going to Congress. He didn't want anybody talking. And he said quite publicly that he would use the pardon power to help those who had been convicted. And so this is just an extraordinary time. It's as though Roy Cohn himself were sitting in the Oval Office. In Nixon, you had a man who had a sense of the country. He knew how the institutions worked. And by and large, although he bent the rules and broke them, he knew there were rules. He understood what they were. He had read the Constitution. He knew what the laws were. Trump, on the other hand, had no respect for the Constitution, for the laws of this country, for the hundreds of years of precedent as to the norms of a president leading this country and being a role model. He did everything that your mother told you was wrong in a person. And yet, despite the evidence of his lies, of his grifting, of his cheating, of his lying in business, the lying about who he was, the lying about being a successful businessman, yet he was able to perpetrate the kind of fraud that P.T. Barnum, another prominent American who was upfront about his attitude toward the masses, was saying, there's a sucker born every minute. And unfortunately, we've seen that become the reality of our political discourse in this country.
Jim, any comments, any questions?
I do not. I think this is a fitting time, Canvas and Richard, particularly on behalf of everyone, to thank you for your gravity, your clarity, your knowledge, and your reflectiveness for all the benefit. We've been the beneficiaries of it. I remind everybody that within roughly 24 hours, a video recording of this event, this program, will be up on the website of the Columbia Club of Washington, D.C. You can tell your friends, family members, associate neighbors of its availability, and I hope lots of people will watch it and benefit from it. So one and all, Richard, thank you on behalf of everybody. Thank you ever so much. And to everyone, good evening, good health, and may the Republic survive.
Thank you. And for my very final remarks, because I've gone on too long, no doubt, for those of you who are left, my words are, we must all get involved. To the greatest extent possible, you need to do your work as a citizen of this country. So go out and do it. Thank you.
Thank you.